Hello everybody, today you've got head coaches Kieran and JB, and today we're going to be talking you through some of the big hybrid training mistakes that we see people make, most commonly when they come to us for coaching that they've already been making. We'll keep this nice and snappy and we're going to get straight into it. JB is going to take you through the first one.
Hello. Right. So let's kick things off. So our first biggest hybrid athlete mistake is booking a massive event too soon. So you've started your hybrid athlete journey, you're nice and excited, crack on with the Ironman straight away. Perhaps, probably not the best idea. So a lot of the processes that need to happen, um, such as getting adequate fitness, learning about like your fueling, your ability to recover, it takes time. So not just from a learning point of view, but also from a changing your body point of view. Some very complex processes have to take place, which take time, and it does kind of mean that it does sort of make sense to have some sort of stepping stones towards those bigger goals. So starting out as a goal, which if you think events are somewhat of an outcome goal, instead setting some earlier process goals. So are you getting all of your ducks in a row with regards to training across the week? Are you prioritizing key sessions? They're much kind of more important goals, which we think you should be prioritizing versus those kind of big, hairy, scary outcome goals, which will come eventually, as we're going to talk about in another point today. But yeah, some of the earlier stuff needs to be respected there as well. Anything else there for you to add, Kieran?
I think a big part of it, we were talking about this a lot over the recent Ardmay weekend, is that a massively overlooked element of this is obviously we want to be training for life, so we want to be enjoying it. And one of the biggest things that I see, and I spoke about this a lot, is that particularly in, let's take the triathlon world as an example, people book the Ironman, the big scary goal, and they spend a lot of money on it. They don't give themselves enough time. Let's say 6 months for a full Ironman, because I'm sure we've all seen people do that, or even less time. Go on any secondhand Facebook page for cycling and you will see the most ridiculous number of bikes, and they all have the same caption. There'll be a 5 or 10 grand bike and it will say, used for Ironman 70.3 Mallorca, sat in the garage for a year since, selling because it's not getting used enough. People have had to make training their entire life in order to get to the start line of this event. And it meant that they hate it, they fall out of love with the sport, and then they end up either not training or sort of thinking that they can't combine these two. So when you give yourself that longer run in, you give yourself more freedom to not make training your life. If you give yourself a year versus say 6 months or less, you give yourself so much more freedom to ramp up slowly and only have to really, really commit to those long training hours in the back end of that year, which you can't do if you give yourself a shorter time. So I think with all of this, particularly for us non-pros, I think it's so important we just don't lose sight of the most important thing for almost all of us is training for the rest of our life, and in order to do so, we have to enjoy it.
For sure, I think it's some of a paradox in it. You kind of, if you go out of the gate with a real kind of severe enthusiasm for these things, quite often, inevitably, you do end up. It's a bit like a pendulum swing. You go from one extreme to the other. You just become sick to the teeth of having pushed it too hard too soon, and you completely fall off the wagon, right?
That's exactly it. It's the same with most things, isn't it? Balance goes such a long way when if you think about the really long-term game, you just can't sustain that kind of effort, particularly if it's something new to your life. You can't sustain it forever. So slow and steady wins the race, as in almost anything.
Sure, man. Right. What's our next one?
So the second mistake that I see a lot of people making, particularly at the moment where hybrid training is becoming more and more popular, it's also attracting more and more pushback. And that mistake is people thinking too small. Now, a lot of people are pushing back against some of these more viral creators, thinking that the only reason they've got where they have is because they've built all of their muscle or strength previously and then have picked up running. And that for the average person who doesn't have their background in one sport or the other, it's very hard to reach a high level in both. And what I think a lot of people are forgetting is that in the short term, of course, you are never going to make such massive progress that you're going to become very, very strong, very muscular, very lean, and very, very fit within, say, 6 months. It's just not going to happen, particularly if you don't have a base in one or the other. But that is absolutely not to discount that you absolutely can get so much further in both disciplines at the same time than most people would realize. I'll use myself as a bit of an example here. So when I first quit powerlifting, I was about 20, I had got to where I did. I was very strong. I got to where I had, making all of the mistakes that we spoke about in the first point. I did it very unsustainably, I did it unhealthily, and I wasn't willing to do those things again. So I thought that realistically, if that's what it took to get strong, well, I'm never going to hit PB again. I'm never going to get to this level of strength again because I'm not going to make those same mistakes. Lo and behold, 5 years later, I'm in touching distance of reaching those same PBs, if not exceeding them, but 10 kilograms lighter, exponentially fitter, leaner, happier, healthier. Because I've given myself that freedom to let things take a bit longer. I'm being patient with my training. And in doing so, I've gotten so much further at the same time with my fitness and my strength developing. I've hit run times I never imagined I would have hit. I'm performing better on the bike than I ever thought I could at my body weight. And it all comes down to patience and realizing what's possible in the long term. So many people are obsessed with that 6-month time frame, but give it much longer periods and you would be amazed at what you can do whilst building up strength and endurance at the same time. And there are plenty of examples of people just like that out there. We're not the exception. There are plenty of people who have made concurrent progress. And just because you're not in that position after 6 months, don't think that it's not possible, because I promise you it is, and we have plenty of examples we can throw at you. Is there anything you'd add there, JB?
Yeah, I think it's all just relative, isn't it? So you might know of someone who can smash out a sub 40-minute 10k or a sub 3 hour marathon, but that doesn't mean that those sorts of endeavours and those race distances are like reserved purely for the very, very, very fit. Like, your ability is all relative. And yeah, if you want to give these things a crack, you absolutely should, as long as you're realistic with the time frames involved and train appropriately. There's no reason why you can't do all these things as well. And I think it's quite interesting, wasn't it? Like chatting to people this weekend. So we had our Ardmade this weekend, where we brought a bunch of great guys and girls together, and we kind of had a lot of chats with them, didn't we, on the trek and on the trail run. And people talking about these goals that they wouldn't have even like contemplated, whether it's 6 months ago or even 6 weeks ago in some cases. It's really, really cool to see. And all of these people, like, it kind of their ability is across like a big kind of variance. And as I say, it doesn't have to be just reserved for the uber fit and elite kind of folk.
Yeah, I think that was probably one of my favourite aspects of the Ardmay weekend was talking to people about that relative challenge. I think it's so easy to forget, particularly with, again, some of the more viral side of things, where people are chasing, and perhaps even we've been guilty of it, chasing these named challenges or certain milestone times and things like that. It's very easy to forget that for some people, something like completing the first 5K is the milestone itself. Just because somebody else is out there running a sub 17-minute time and they're jacked whilst doing it doesn't mean that the relative challenge is any different for your starting point. And we had Josh over on the Ardmay weekend, and he'd only started running 6 weeks ago. He'd never trained 6 weeks before the Ardmay weekend, and then he's out there crushing hikes for the first time. It was his first hike ever on 6 weeks of training. What can be achieved relative to your start state is absolutely massive, and I think that's so easy to lose sight of. I think that it's important to remember that thinking big doesn't necessarily have to mean these grand milestones if that's not where your relative starting point is. And just, I suppose, to add to that is that just because you are starting from humble beginnings doesn't mean that you can't make very, very significant progress over the years, particularly if you train in the way that we're going to talk about, sustainably and with a little bit less of each than you might think. Then there is no reason that 5 years down the line you can't be an absolute unit in both disciplines if you so wish.
No, agreed, man. And I suppose maybe going off on a bit of a tangent as well, but you do have to kind of strip these things back and say, like, right, if I could no longer PB, would I still do all of these things? Like, do I still enjoy it, irrespective of what sort of, like, time I'm getting around a marathon in or whatever else? I think that's hugely important, because obviously, like, progress at some point stops becoming linear, whether that's due to age or injury or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's definitely important to kind of forgive the cliche, but like find your why with all these kind of things, and doing it because you love it, doing it for the right reasons. Right, what do you reckon? Next one?
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. So the next one is training like your favourite influencers. A lot of the time, these influencers, athletes, whatever you want to label them as, they're not often like the average person, which could be you or I. So quite often it is literally their job. It's what it's what pays the bills, it's what put food on the table, to train, and they do a lot of it, and they can have some insane performances which may not be accessible to us kind of more normal folk. So quite often this will come in the form of like crushing double days, big volumes, because they have the time required not only to train but also to recover. We often forget that your kind of your stress isn't just limited to training; it's also limited to like financial stresses, family stresses, other life stresses. All of that kind of compounds in the kind of the average Joe, and it means that you don't quite get the training adaptations that you might like. And yeah, so it's a very different game for the kind of the Instagram influencers and Instagram athletes compared to the normal person. Yeah, anything else you would want to add there, mate? Kind of getting people to remember that it's we're not kind of built the same.
Yeah, I think there's another element almost linked to point two about not thinking too small, in that people massively overestimate how much work is required in each discipline to get as far as we have. Again, I'll use myself as an example, as somebody with sort of above average stats, shall we say, in both disciplines. I'm by no means as freakish as some of the people out there, but recent running example, so a 37-minute 10K was achieved off an average of 3 runs a week. So I'm not out there hitting crazy. You see so many people run every day, lift every evening, for example. They're crushing 6 runs a week, and then they're hitting sort of like push-pull legs 6 times a week. And it's just so unnecessary. I've got to where I have with some of the challenges I've pulled off. You can go back to other podcasts and listen to 500-pound deadlift and sub 5-minute mile in the same day. I got to where I did on those with 4 lifting sessions and 3 running sessions a week, a max of 1 to 2 double days. And that is more than enough work over a long enough time scale. You think about how far you can get. Stack up 3 runs a week for 5 or 10 years. That is an awful amount of running. And that compounds over time. You really, really don't need to be doing such absurd volumes, particularly if you're average Joe, or you're combining these other elements as well. So yeah, link to point number 2, don't think that just because you're not an influencer and you can't train these double days every day of the week, that you can't still take this very, very far.
It's just good old fashioned hard work compounded over time, isn't it? Like, and
Exactly
often it's not glamorous. You're not like most of us have to work at quote unquote usual work time, so it's not all just finishing your run in an exotic location and finishing with a flat white and a croissant every training session or whatever. I'm being a bit of a knob there, but you know what I mean. Like, it's all just about kind of getting the work done when you can, however you can. And just doing your best, and your best might not look like the influencer's output, I guess is what we're trying to say, and that's fine.
Absolutely. And capitalizing on that sort of limited time leads us really nicely into point 4, in that people are so scared because of these arbitrary rules that they've heard of training intensely these days. So you may well have heard of the 80-20 rule. And one of the issues with these sort of really nice sound bites is that people who don't necessarily understand coaching, they haven't made it their job, pick up on these little things. And sports like high rocks have made endurance training more popular for the average person who previously was only doing sort of gym work, or perhaps they were doing CrossFit and less running, for example. And so all of a sudden, people started looking into how to train running and things like this. They hear about the 80-20 rule, and influencers parrot it without understanding what they're talking about, or perhaps they're putting in much higher training volumes. The example that I like to give for people that haven't heard of this rule, it's essentially the idea that elite athletes spend the vast majority of their training time, sort of 80 to 90% of it, doing very easy, low intensity work that's easy to recover from, so that they can accumulate the high volumes they need. And then only the final sort of, call it 10 to 20, maybe 30% of their training is the more intense work. Now, let's take the example of a person running 20 kilometers a week, which quite frankly is realistically more than the average person. That is not an insignificant amount of running. Now, applying the 80-20 rule to somebody running 20 kilometers a week would tell you that doing a park run would be too much intensity for that person, which we all know, like when you put it like that, it just sounds like nonsense. We all know that if you have limited training time, doing less than a park run a week of hard training isn't going to get you to improve very efficiently at all. So the body, particularly when we're not training with high volumes, absolutely can recover from more than 20% of our training being hard. And I would go so far as to say that you shouldn't be applying the 80-20 rule if you are not a significant endurance athlete. If you are not deliberately pushing higher than average training volumes in the endurance disciplines, the 80-20 rule shouldn't really factor into your training. And there's evidence to back that up, that sort of more biased training towards those moderate and highest intensities works better in beginners. There's plenty of evidence for that. So if you are your average Joe listening to this, you should probably forget that you've ever heard of the 80-20 rule, unless you're going all in on something like Ironman prep. But even then, making best use of limited time is probably not going to be the answer to all of your problems. Anything to add there, JB?
Yeah, I think it's like having these sort of arbitrary rules, exactly, kind of like it intimidates people into and confuses people, whereas really, like a lot of the time, the vast majority of people don't really need to worry about like, I need to get this side of it. It could be like the intensity of it. Exactly right. Really, they just need to get out and do some training. That's the most important thing. Not to get bogged down into the details so much that you not end up doing the session at all, which is actually quite common. People just get so worried and wrapped up in like, oh, am I doing it right? Am I not? It's a very significant source of stress for them. Sometimes you just need to not worry. So even if you do the session quote unquote wrong, it's not like there's like an off switch where now you're not getting any adaptation from the session at all. You might have overcooked your easy run a little bit. You might have gone a little bit too intensely, but that doesn't mean that the run hasn't worked. It doesn't mean that it hasn't had the desired effect. You might have a little bit more of a recovery cost coming at the other side of it, but it is it is not the case at all that run wouldn't be effective. And I think as well, like even though we've said the 80-20 rule can probably be discounted for most of us kind of normies, our usual athletes, everyday Joes, that isn't the green light that you can kind of, if we've assigned you like an easy run, you can just go out and treat it like a time trial, of course. It just means that you don't need to be too kind of like nitpicky about the allocation of intensity across your week to an exact proportion of 80-20. That's not how it needs to work at all. So that leads us on nicely onto our next point, which is to not obsess over recovery. So a lot of people worry about recovery, which really a lot of the time means that they have waited far too long to address the issue and the horse has already bolted. So instead, say in our last point, we used the example of pushing like a zone 2 session too hard and you end up with that kind of recovery cost that perhaps wasn't worthwhile. We instead, rather than worrying about like, right, I need to do an ice bath to numb the pain, I need to do some sort of active recovery to get the blood flowing and stuff like that. Instead, if you'd just done the session correctly in the first place, you wouldn't have to worry. Instead of kind of being concerned about, aforementioned ice baths, what type of supplements to take to enhance recovery and prevent muscle soreness or whatever else, is instead just making sure that your training program is well structured enough so that one session leads on nicely to the other. You're not training with such a high volume and intensity that it's leaving you feeling absolutely crippled and having insane DOMs and muscle soreness and stuff. And yeah, just making sure that the program is addressed. And I think that is a massively often overlooked thing in a world where, indeed ice baths are pushed, saunas are pushed, compression garments are pushed. You probably don't need to worry about half of this stuff if you just make sure you train properly in the first place. And anything else to add there, mate?
Yeah, I think obviously there's the element you're talking about where if people are training hard, perhaps they're training too hard, for example, and they need to address the programming or the nutrition and the sleep, which obviously are always going to be our big rocks. There's also the other element that we were talking about in the other point where most people realistically aren't training hard enough to need this kind of thing in the first place. And exactly what you've mentioned there with a lot of these garments and these things. A lot of gyms, I've been to a lot recently where they're really pushing this kind of thing. They'll have recovery rooms and things like this. Now, as a coach, you walk into any sort of commercial gym and 90% of people there aren't training, particularly in their strength training. The bar is barely slowing down by the last rep, for example. The vast majority of people aren't pushing themselves anywhere near as hard. The vast majority of people are walking on the treadmill, for example. And that's absolutely fine. That is not to belittle that. But that's to say that that is not the kind of training where you need these almost like athlete gym level recovery rooms. An average Joe, as we've been talking about this whole podcast, you absolutely do not need to be hyper obsessing over these kind of things. And I know that a lot of gyms are really pushing this at the moment, but it is just a non-issue for most people. There's a good chance that you're probably not pushing your training hard enough. If you're listening to this podcast, you may well fall into the camp where perhaps you need to dial back the intense work. You might well be that kind of athlete that's very driven. However, the vast majority of people are not and do not need to be over obsessing on this thing. If your training load is in a good place, if you're eating well, and if you're sleeping well, that takes care of 95%, realistically, if not more, of the recovery needs for the average person.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing, just to add to that, is a lot of the time these recovery methods don't actually work. Like, they have no real evidence base behind them of any sort of robustness, if that's a word. Yeah, like it's kind of I like to think of these things like you've only got so many fucks to give, and if you give too many fucks on the wrong thing, it means you're not putting fucks into the correct stuff. And by kind of worrying about these silly little details that aren't going to yield any benefit, you're just wasting your time. As a broader point, and sadly we can apply that principle to a lot of stuff outside of recovery as well. But I think that's one thing where people often do fall into the trap of thinking it's going to make a massive difference, but it actually really doesn't.
I think that's a very eloquent motto for life there, JB.
Oh, you've only got so many fucks to give. Yeah.
I'm going to put that in the back pocket and remember that one.
For sure. Yeah, you can keep that.
There we are. And that leads us on to our final mistake we're going to talk about today, and that's not understanding that fatigue masks fitness. So this is a key concept that if you've ever studied sports science or physiology, you'll probably have come across. Fatigue being, just call it tiredness. Obviously, there's a lot of things that trigger this, our own training, and then also life stress, poor night's sleep. Any of these aspects contribute to fatigue. Fitness, of course, being your ability to express your current ability. If you're in the depths of a particularly deep marathon training block, for example, you are probably running a lot. Your long runs are going to get particularly long, and you're going to be tired. It is extremely hard to train effectively for a marathon and not feel tired. It is almost the entire point of marathon training. Now, it is very common that fatigue is going to bleed over into other sessions, particularly if your program isn't the best designed. Now, it is very normal that if you've had a marathon long run on the Saturday, so perhaps you're covering, let's say, 15 miles, some of that might be at race pace work, that's a big session. Even if you have a full rest day on Sunday, there's a very good chance the fatigue of that is still impacting you on Monday, where perhaps you might have your intervals or some of your strength work. And you might go into those sessions feeling like you're going backwards. And it's very common for people to get in their heads about this and think, oh, I'm doing something wrong, this program isn't working, this isn't for me, or think that hybrid training itself is to blame. Not understanding that fatigue is transient, and when you apply a bit of rest, when you hit, say, a deload in a training program or a taper prior to a race, where you drop that fatigue, it allows you to actually express your fitness. And this is where sort of like the magic of the taper comes in. It doesn't mean that you've gone backwards. A lot of the time, there is often just an element of trusting the process and understanding that when you're training for something hard, it's going to impact other areas. You're going to be tired. You are going to have sessions where you don't feel $1 million. It's not every session is going to be an absolute ripper where you set PBs and everything's going amazing, even if you're getting fitter. If you look at the start of the program all the way to the end, if you're following things correctly and your lifestyle factors are in check, there is a very good chance you are getting fitter, even if throughout that journey you have little blips where all of that fatigue is really building up and it's stopping you expressing your true level of fitness. So it's a concept that a lot of people forget about, and a very important one, particularly when we have hybrid training in the mix where you've got multiple modalities to recover from. You've got the impact of, say, your strength work on your endurance and vice versa. So you've got more to think about and juggle than your average, for example, I'm going to keep coming back to it, the marathon program. So it's just a concept that is really important for us where there is going to be some bleed over fatigue if we're not careful.
Yeah, for sure. I think using myself as an example, I've experienced it so many times in marathon training programs, half marathon training programs, where you're really kind of pushing the volume up high. You're tired, you're indeed fatigued, and you might have a session that might be right, run 40 minutes at marathon pace, and it's really hard. But it's because you're so fatigued. You're asking yourself to, quote unquote, only run 40 minutes at marathon pace, the kind of pace that you expect yourself to run in however many weeks' time for a whole duration of a marathon. But that 40 minutes is a reasonable expectation because you've got that cloak of fatigue. And indeed, when you remove that cloak of fatigue by doing your taper, your deload, whatever you want to call it, you should be able to almost like unlock your ability to indeed be able to run an entire marathon or half marathon at that expected pace, or at least that's the plan, right? And I think I say like that's the plan as if like it could go wrong, and sometimes it does go wrong. And I think it's really important as an individual, and it builds up with experience. And obviously, as coaches, we learn from our athletes as well by observing, looking at data and stuff. Is understanding that, like, you know, people deal with fatigue in different ways, and sometimes people need longer tapers, some people need shorter tapers, might be more aggressive, might be less aggressive to indeed unlock their performance. I know Fergus used it as an example, didn't it, when he said sometimes you would powerlift, so you do your powerlifting competition, you'd be building up your training volume, tapering off by increasing your intensity, dropping off your volume. You wouldn't hit what you expect to hit at that powerlifting meet, but you didn't go on holiday the week after, and then you come back and you hit some amazing PBs. Basically just means that fatigue didn't quite go away at the rate that we would have hoped. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well as an additional point. Cool. Anything else to add there, mate?
No, I think you summed that up really nicely. It is just one of those things that's individual. And I think this is where having an objective set of eyes can be so helpful, whether that's hiring a coach, whether that's a community like ours in Omnia, where you've got all of these people that you can talk to. Obviously, we see it quite a lot where people will have a question or something they're not quite sure about, and they pop it in the community, and then there'll be a whole thread of answers of people chiming in with their experience. I've seen it recently with people talking about nerves prior to races and talking about the tapers, and you see all the individual perspectives there. So I think that's something that a lot of people can really benefit from, with that objective set of eyes. And there's obviously a fair few places you can get that from.
I mean, ours is the best, so, you know.
Absolutely.
And it was so seamlessly plugged as well. Great.
Look at that, I'm a pro.
Yeah. So I guess all that's left to say is the link to join doing what we do, which is gold, silver, bronze memberships. So gold is working one-to-one with either myself or Kieran, really dialing in detail to your goals in a personalised nature. And we've also got the silver and bronze memberships as well, where you get the same great access to all of the coaches and staff here at Omnia and your fellow athletes in the Circle group. We've got a great community there, all running some superb training programs, running all the way from, it could be your first run, all the way up to finishing an Ironman triathlon. So we've got some real kind of great spectrum of stuff going on there. I think that's everything, isn't it? Hope to see you all guys soon. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.